Welcome to this enduring webinar, Dispelling Misunderstanding and Misinformation around Food Ingredients, Food Additives, and Colors. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, and I'm the moderator for this activity. Before we get started, I have a few points of housekeeping. In order to claim your CPE credit, you will have to remain with us for the entire hour-long presentation. Dispelling Misunderstanding and Misinformation around Food Ingredients, Food Additives, and Colors awards 1.25 CPEUs in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration's CPEU Prior Approval Program. The responsible provider for this activity is National Confectioners Association. Funding from non-CPE revenue for CPE planning, development, review, and/or presentation has been provided by National Confectioners Association. You will hear the relevant disclosures from each faculty member during their portion of the presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. James Coughlin and Farida Mohamedshah. Dr. Coughlin received his MS in Food Science and Technology, his PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, and completed his postdoctoral training in Environmental Toxicology at the University of California, Davis, with a major research focus on heat-processed carcinogens. He is a certified food scientist and elected fellow of the Institute of Food Technologists, or IFT, and was honored in 2020 with IFT's prestigious Bernard L. Ozer Food Ingredient Safety Award. Dr. Coughlin initially worked for 2 years at Armour Foods on nitrate-processed meat safety, then spent a decade at General Foods, Kraft General Foods, headquarters in directing external scientific fairs, and since 1992 has been an independent consultant in food toxicology and global regulatory affairs in Southern California. He served for 17 years as IFT's Codex Subject Expert on Contaminants in Food, and from 2002 to 2008 on the IFT Expert Panel assisting FDA in assessing food bioterrorism defense. In addition to his 43 years dedicated to coffee and health science, 50 years involvement with meat and health, and 37 years expertise on California Proposition 65, his scientific efforts have mainly focused on benefit-risk assessment of foods, food ingredients, and dietary supplements. He is specialized in risk assessment and risk communication concerning whole foods, food additives, GRAS additives, and contaminants. Dr. Coughlin provides strategic scientific, toxicologic, nutritional, communications, and regulatory counsel to many food, functional food, and dietary supplement, chemical and consumer product companies and their trade associations, law firms, and public relations firms. Farida Mohamedshah, in her role as Senior Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the National Confectioners Association, oversees scientific and regulatory matters relevant to the confectionery industry. She leads the development of advocacy propositions on food and nutrition policy, including food safety, food labeling, Prop 65, allergens, and helps NCA members to be compliant with current and proposed regulations. She oversees the association's relationships with regulators and provides the association and its member companies with timely information on nutrition, food safety, and other regulations that impact the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of confectionery. Before joining NCA, Farida was the Director of Food, Health, and Nutrition at IFT, serving as its principal scientific and technical resource on food and nutrition policy issues. She has published papers in the fields of nutrition and food science, and she's a member of the American Society for Nutrition, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and the Institute of Food Technologists. As a nutritionist, she works on a GRAS dossier and reviews for health and structure function claims for nutrients and bioactive components. Farida received a Bachelor of Science in Home Economics and a Master of Science in Textile Chemistry and Clothing from the University of Bombay, and a Master of Science in Human Nutrition and Food Systems from the University of Maryland. Welcome to you both, and I'm pleased to now turn it over to Dr. Coughlin to get things kicked off.
Yes, I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to give this presentation today on dispelling misunderstandings around food additives, ingredients, and colors. Let me start with my disclosure slide. I am a consultant for the past 34 years doing independent consulting in food toxicology, chemistry, and regulatory affairs in the state of California, Orange County. What I'd like to do today, this is the presentation outline. I'll set the stage before I change to the next slide, but I want to talk about some just background information on food toxicology, hazard identification, and risk assessment. Also touch on the European Union's Precautionary Principle because it gets to be very important. I'll then dig into state regulation of food additives, and it's mainly been my own state of California that has caused much of this initial activity. I'll get into some key food additives that have been under scrutiny at both the state and the federal level. Give you an update on this year's new programs under the FDA, under the new Trump administration and RFK Jr. Handling of Health and Human Services. I'm not sure if I'll be able to predict where we're going to go from here, but we can talk about that as we go through. And I just want to urge at the end that there's very key role for registered dietitians because of their great ability to share information. They can ensure that there's a lot of trust in the U.S. food supply. This is a guy named Paracelsus. He was a 16th century physician, scientist, alchemist. There was a lot of different names for him. He was an MD. And he is considered the founder of toxicology. This what his precept was back in many centuries ago, that poison isn't everything and no thing is without poison. The dosage makes it either a poison or a remedy. A shorthand version of this, which I would like you to remember, you've probably heard it before, is that the dose makes the poison. And as I go through some of the methodologies on risk assessment, hazard assessment, and getting into some of the very food chemicals that are key to the debate right now, I just want you to remember that the dose makes the poison. This is the toxicologist's standard dose response curve that drives most everything we do. The two axes going on the y-axis is the increasing effect of some toxic response, and that could be a toxic response to how many tumors are being formed in an animal study. Perhaps it might be a liver enzyme that is being adversely affected. It could be the number of birth defects that are being discovered in an animal testing study. And along the bottom axis is the increasing dose of the chemical. And in rat, mouse, and other laboratory animal studies, we test them for their lifetime. And for rats and mice, that's a 2-year lifetime. That's about the standard lifetime of a mouse or rat. And so up here at the maximum effect range and coming down the S-shaped curve, these are the doses that we actually test in the animal studies, because we have to try to determine, does this chemical, and in the case of what we're talking about today, does this food chemical have the ability to, say, increase tumors or increase birth defects or have adverse effects on the central nervous system? The key trick in all of this, however, is as we test up here, and this could be our lower dose, we often test food chemicals at 1 and 2 and 5% of the total diet of the test animals. This is where we test, but humans are exposed way down here at this lower part of the curve. And I'll go through some steps on how we determine how humans are exposed. But the trick is we see effects here, and how do we extrapolate back to the effects that humans are actually being exposed to in their diet at very decreasing dose levels. This is a scheme. It's a process that's been around. It's the risk analysis process that's been around for over 4 decades now. And these 3 circles are joined: risk assessment, the green circle, risk management in pink, and the risk communication circle in purple. There's some bullets there that describe what risk assessment is. I'm going to go into the risk assessment part in more detail, but this is where all the science is done. We determine the hazards, we try to characterize the risk, we try to quantify the risk in this whole science-based risk assessment process. What happens next is the risk management phase of this process. And this is a policy-based phase where an agency like US FDA, or say the European Food Safety Authority, or authorities in Canada and other countries, try to determine how they're going to manage the risk that's been decided by the risk assessment process. So they evaluate, they try to manage the risks, they monitor the risks in an ongoing way. The final step, and we're going to be talking more about this today, the importance of dietitians in this whole process, is the risk communication phase, which talks about what you learn in the risk assessment phase, what you learn in the risk management phase, and then try to exchange information among everybody who's been involved in the process. And the most important piece of this is, and there's so much consumer confusion these days in the area of food additives, it's how to communicate these things to the public, to consumers. So these three things can intersect there, and where you deal with both the risk assessment, management, and communication. I've spent a lot of my career in the middle of all of this, involved in all three aspects. This is a more detailed representation, the scheme of the risk assessment process. And in the upper left, the hazard identification, that is the determination of what is the toxic endpoint. Is it cancer? Is it heart disease? Is it central nervous system effect? Is it a birth defect? Trying to name and determine what the hazard is in any particular organ. We then do the dose response testing in animal studies, like I showed you earlier, the S-shaped curve to determine how much the chemical causes the effect at different doses. And very importantly, for what we do in dietary exposure assessment, we want to determine what is the human exposure of this food chemical that people are actually going to be exposed to as they consume the various foods that have the food chemical. You put all of that together, you do a risk characterization, and here this in the corner, the most important word there is potential risk to humans. You do a risk characterization, you're trying to estimate, you're trying to extrapolate what the risk of the chemical might be potentially to humans. It's not a certainty that there's that risk, but you're trying to find the potential of the chemical to cause the toxic effect. These are the key determinants, the three steps in the risk assessment process that were pictured earlier in the first circle. If I wanted you to remember the dose makes the poison as something very important, I've highlighted here in red that the hazard times the exposure equals the risk. If you could kind of lock that into your minds, that's what we're going to be talking about. What is the hazard? How much are people exposed? And then what is the potential risk to humans? In the hazard identification part, which is always the first step, you look at the weight of the scientific evidence for all possible adverse health effects of the food chemical, based upon what's in the public literature, various reports that are done by international agencies, even including our federal agencies, and then try to determine what pathways may lead to exposure and try to identify what the key pathways are. Hazards, as I've talked about earlier, are identified mainly based on experimental animal studies. That was that S-shaped dose response curve that I showed you. But it's also, you take into account human epidemiological studies, in vitro tests, and I'll be talking about one of our most important in vitro tests, which are genotoxicity tests. And also you look at the environmental effects of the food chemical. In the next step, after identifying what the hazard is, you try to characterize and assess it. This is both a qualitative and quantitative activity where you try to describe the relationship between the dose that was administered to the animals, or in our case of humans, what the exposure is and what the potential human health effects may be. The required toxicity data we use are provided from controlled experiments, as I said, with lab animals. And what you try to determine is the most critical effect. It's, say, in a rat or mouse study, and that is the test, that is the dose at which the effect occurs at the lowest possible dose. And you want to also look at and take into account when you look at the whole database of animal testing, which species, is it the rat, is it the mouse, is it the guinea pig that is most sensitive, to try to determine what is the most critical hazard endpoint. You then jump to the risk assessment process, and this is an important step where you try to determine what the humans are going to be exposed to, the human food consumer is going to be exposed to. And you determine from the first two steps in the final risk assessment what the estimated daily intake of that food chemical is likely to be in the foods that you're requesting permission for it to be in. You then calculate the risk based upon, we have various methodologies, risk assessment methodologies. We can also use safety factors of 100 and sometimes more to try to determine what the acceptable daily intake is from all of your experiments. And the key thing here is that the acceptable daily intake must be higher than what the humans are going to be exposed to by consuming any particular food. I want to mention the European Union's precautionary principle because it's really coming into force, especially as states have taken action over the past 3 or 4 years in regulating food and color additives. This precautionary principle had its origin in the 1980s around environmental policy in Europe, and it was a practicing the foresight to prevent long-range environmental problems in Europe. However, the EU now invokes this precautionary principle in relation to potential food hazards. It has done this for many years. This quote is from a 2000 document on the precautionary principle noted below. And in quotes there, when there are reasonable grounds for concern that potential hazards may affect the environment or human, animal, or plant health, and when at the same time the available data preclude a detailed risk evaluation. So this is the principle that has been driving a lot of what's been happening here in the US. What you get with the precautionary approach is you're trying to find out how much harm can be avoided, say, by banning the chemical, rather than determining how much risk is acceptable by doing a proper scientifically based risk assessment. So this risk aversion paradigm under the precautionary principle favors a hazard-based approach where you just wonder, does it cause cancer? Does it cause birth defects? Without actually doing the risk assessment. And what you get with this use of the precautionary principle is you're trying to remove all exposures to anything that might cause harm so that you don't have to manage the risks if you allow that chemical to be used in the food supply. Let me jump now to state regulation of food additives and color additives. This has been popping very much in the past 3 or 4 years, especially here in the state of California. California has led this activity. In late 2023, the California Food Safety Act was enacted into law, signed by Governor Newsom. It started out as an assembly bill that proposed to ban brominated vegetable oil, potassium bromate, propylparaben, which is an antioxidant, and the now famous color red 3 in food products sold in California, claiming that there was links to cancer, nervous system effects, hyperactivity, ADHD, and those kinds of endpoints. And the assemblyman who started this, and he gathered the rest of his assembly members around him, they kept saying, why should Europeans have safer foods? Because there's a couple of additives that FDA still allows that Europe had banned earlier. And so the California legislators were saying, why should Europe have safer foods than people in California? The key, though, is that some of these decisions made by the European Union were based on precautionary principle, which only looked at the hazard and not looked at the risk. So this California Act of 2023 has been the catalyst for legislation over the past 2 years in several other states. I don't think this count is accurate anymore, probably, but there's certainly over 30 states that are considering similar actions, and some states have already acted on it. I want to highlight what Texas did. The Make Texas Healthy Again Act was passed in June 2025. And this was not a ban like the California Food Safety Act of these four food additives, but they identified 44 specified food additives in this act, and they demanded on-pack warning labels on foods and beverages. And this is the warning statement. Warning, this product contains an ingredient that is not recommended for human consumption by the appropriate authority in Australia, Canada, the European Union, or the United Kingdom. I've been at this business for 46 years now in the food industry, working both in the US and globally. And I've never seen anything quite like this, where this state of Texas has decided if some other authority around the world has already not recommended it for consumption, you have to put this warning label on the product. And these 44, I'm sorry, specified food ingredients include all of the synthetic colors, bleach flour, potassium bromate, emulsifiers, a whole list of chemicals that FDA, by the way, I'll tell you more about, is now looking at all of these chemicals. This law, however, does carve out some exemptions for ingredients that are determined by FDA or USDA to be safe. The key battleground, where California, after banning those four additives in 2023, the California Senate gave $500,000 to an agency within the California Environmental Protection Agency. That agency is called OEHA. It is the Office for Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And the Senate wanted OEHA, again, an environmental agency, to review all of the effects of the colors, the synthetic food dyes, on neurobehavioral effects, mainly in children. I want to point out that OEHA is the agency within California EPA that has been in charge of California Proposition 65 law and regulations for the past 35 years. So, they have had some interactions with foods, but they're mainly the California EPA risk assessment agencies. They determined, this was a 350-page report with about 20 different authors. They determined that the synthetic dyes are associated with adverse neurobehavioral effects in kids, things like attention deficit disorder, and there's some mention of autism as well. However, this report was careful to not claim that there was any causation that has ever been shown scientifically in any of these studies that go back over the past 30 years. So once this report was complete, driven by the California Senate, the Assembly then got involved. California Assembly Bill 2316 was initiated in the Senate. It was discussed also in the, initiated in the Assembly. It went off to the Senate. Governor Newsom signed this into law in September 2024, banning the use of 6 synthetic food colors in foods and beverages for sale or for use in public school feeding programs. And this law signed by the governor was effective in July of this year. A very interesting development, however, at the very same time, almost on the very same day that Governor Newsom signed this law in September 2024, the California Department of Public Health, which has a food and drug branch, this is equivalent to kind of a California FDA. They were looking at a petition that the Center for Science and the Public Interest, CSPI, filed in 2022, demanding warnings on labels of foods and supplements that contain these dyes. This department, the Food and Drug Branch, was asked to look at it. Their scientists studied it, and they came to the conclusion that there was no scientific consensus regarding the health effects of these colors. So really strange. I know strange things do happen in California, but the governor signs a bill to ban 6 colors almost on the same day that his Food and Drug Branch said there's no basis to do this kind of a warning and do this kind of a banning. So rather strange, and it's being debated certainly out here and around the rest of the country right now. But there's some very key scientific facts that aren't being discussed. They're being disregarded. Just like the OEHA report said, they could not show any causation. There was no evidence of that these colors actually cause these adverse neurobehavioral effects. There were only weak correlations or weak associations. Not mentioned any place in the report, and it's a very systematic review, 350 pages. These colors are very poorly absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. So as the colors come in with foods, only about 5 to 10% of it ever gets absorbed from the GI tract. The rest of it goes right out in feces. But this report from California makes no mention of this very poor absorption ability by the human GI tract. Also, very interesting, and there's not a lot of data on this, but there's little chance shown in the literature that these colors, which are large molecular weight, 5, 6, and 700 molecular weight compounds, that are very, most of them are very highly charged. They are so large and so charged that they don't even have the capability of crossing the blood-brain barrier. In other words, they don't even hardly get into the brain. So if they don't get into the brain, how can they be causing neurobehavioral effects? And nobody in California and at FDA, who I'll talk about soon, are looking at these same colors. Nobody wants to talk about this poor absorption and the fact that these chemicals hardly get to the brain. Let me jump now, we're past the states. Let's jump on FDA focus on food ingredients. And this is a scheme from FDA's webpage on regulating food and color additives. Down the left side here is a chemical going through the food additive petition process. So someone can say, I would like a new sweetener, a new emulsifier, a new color. I'm sorry, not color, that's on the next slide. Going down this food additive petition route, all of the data is studied. There's a notice and comment rulemaking. There's a final rule that's put into the Federal Register, and the food additive is approved. And we've had many, many food additives go through this route. The other route that was put into play in the 1958 Food Additives Amendment is called the GRAS review. GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. And it's a very similar process in terms of looking at all of the data that's available on any specific potential GRAS chemical. But instead of approval by the FDA, expert panels of learned scientists get together. They're food ingredient companies that want to try to get something through the GRAS process, have expert panels meet. I have served on many dozens of these expert panels through the decades. And you look at all of the same data, it's required that you reach all of the same standards, that there's a reasonable certainty that there's no harm. And you can then declare that your food chemical is generally recognized as safe. There is a process that was set in place in the same Food Additives Amendment of 1958, where all GRAS, whether it goes through what we're showing here as self-affirmed or through a notice process at FDA, it's all voluntary in nature. Ingredient manufacturers are encouraged to submit formal GRAS notifications to FDA. It can take upwards of a year, sometimes more, to get FDA. You're seeking there a letter from FDA not objecting to the use of the chemical. But we also, in the food ingredient world, have this ability to self-affirm the safety of an ingredient through expert panel determinations and, not notice the FDA, just kind of keep it in your files, but actually start using the chemical in the U.S. food supply. This is called the self-affirmed GRAS, or the self-affirmation process. It's under intense scrutiny by the new administration. They are proposing to come out with a proposed rule perhaps later this month to try to change the process. And what they want to do is ban this idea of using the self-affirmed GRAS process. This is a scheme, and this is separate for color additives. This is a scheme in FDA's current webpage that you can see the link listed below on how a new color additive is run through the process. It's very, very similar to how a food additive must go through the process, but very important. Within color additives, there's no opportunity to do a GRAS determination. All color additives, the ones we're using today, went through this process, an open review process at FDA where the color was approved. And so it's separate from a food additive process, but it's also, we are unable to use the GRAS process to get a food color approved. I said I was going to talk about some specific food additives that have gotten in trouble recently. The most famous one, certainly, of this year is FD&C Red Number 3. Back in 1990, FDA looked at the data on a rat feeding study of Red 3 and decided to ban the use of Red 3 in cosmetics and externally applied drugs, but they did not at the time ban it for use in foods. And since 1990, we've learned an awful lot about this rat study. That was a very well-performed study. There's strong evidence that Red 3 is not genotoxic, therefore it cannot react with DNA. It was shown only to be carcinogenic in a rat feeding study, and only the male rats, and only those at the very highest dose. There was 3 doses tested, and only at the highest dose did thyroid tumors get produced in the male rat. There was no tumors at all in the female rats, in mice, in guinea pigs, never been shown in humans to cause cancer. The tumors were only benign in origin. They were not malignant tumors, and I've never seen in my history a chemical that causes only benign tumors being banned. Researchers worked hard on why it happened in the male thyroid only, and why only at the highest dose. They determined that there was a secondary mechanism of carcinogenesis because of this very high dose of Red 3 at the highest dose only. There was thyroid toxicity, and it isn't really a cancer effect, it's a thyroid toxicity effect. And so it was determined during the 90s that there was a threshold for Red 3. There was a threshold of exposure where the human cancer risk is negligible. Various expert bodies around the world, including JECFA, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, and the European Food Safety Authority, have come to the same conclusions. There was a citizens petition by a group of NGOs that was sent to FDA to look at Red 3, looking at this old data, but not taking into account any of the findings I have listed there in the second bullet. And earlier this year, actually mid-January of this year, before the new administration, FDA banned Red 3. In their document on the website, they admit that Red 3 posed absolutely no cancer risk to humans. Not just a little risk that we're willing to accept, there was absolutely no risk to humans. But at that same 1958 Food Additives Amendment had a clause called the Delaney Clause that said, If cancer is produced in any animal at any dose, the chemical must be banned. So FDA banned Red 3, completely did not look at the science of Red 3, and they determined that they had to ban it because it's just a matter of law. And so this is kind of the use of Europe's precautionary principle. The hazard of cancer was there because tumors were seen in the male rat, but the agency determined that there was no risk, but they went ahead and banned it anyway. But going back in history, and I've dealt with most of these chemicals sometimes 30 and 40 years ago, the Delaney Clause, again, the clause that says you must ban a chemical coming out of the 1958 Food Additives Amendment. Studies in rats were done on saccharin during the 70s, linking saccharin to bladder cancer. And again, it was just like Red 3. It was male rats only at the highest dose, not in female rats, not in mice, not in guinea pigs. But that was our only, at the time, late 70s, that was our only sweetener before many others have since been approved. And Congress got into the act and decided that, well, we can't ban our only sweetener, artificial sweetener. So they decided that all foods containing saccharin should be labeled with a cancer warning. They did not invoke Delaney, even though saccharin did produce tumors at the high dose in the male rat bladder. Again, a lot of science was done after this act by Congress in 1977. Really top scientists in the US and overseas looked at trying to determine why did the saccharin at this high dose only in the male rat thyroid, why did it produce it? They determined what was now known as the secondary mechanism. There was toxicity related to that highest dose only in the male. And every global US and global agency in the world that had saccharin on their cancer lists actually removed saccharin, said it was no longer carcinogenic because this finding in the male rat thyroid was just not relevant to humans. I worked quite a bit in the 80s on BHA and BHT. These are two synthetic antioxidants that used to be used more in foods. For BHA, there was a Japanese lifetime study in rats. It was a cancer bioassay that showed tumors increasing in the forestomach of the animals. But we humans don't even have four stomachs. So nobody banned FDA at that time. FDA continues even to this day to allow its continued use because it was an irrelevant finding. It produced tumors in an organ that we don't even have. BHT, on the other hand, did produce in a Danish rat study published in the 80s, it did produce liver tumors. But this particular study, unlike how we usually do them in the US, where we end the study at the traditional 2-year lifetime of a rat or mouse, this study was allowed in rats to go out 40 weeks longer. And, a 2-year study is 104 weeks. So it was allowed to go out 40 weeks longer until the animals naturally died. And the irony here is that BHT, it was such a fantastic antioxidant. It was so protective of the organs in the animals that they prolonged the rats' lives to such an old age that they got the tumors, liver tumors, that all old aged rats get anyway, even when they're not treated with a chemical. So today, BHA and BHT are both still allowed, but they're under scrutiny by FDA. Titanium dioxide is another. This is our most valuable white color additive. FDA is currently looking at another petition by activist organizations to ban titanium dioxide in foods. And this was triggered by Europe again, the Europe Precautionary Principle. The European Food Safety Authority concluded in 2021 they were worried about genotoxicity, which is the precursor to cancer. It's where a chemical can react with DNA. They could not determine that genotoxicity, it could not be ruled out, and they considered it no longer safe, and they banned the use of titanium dioxide as a white food additive. However, there's been many reviews even before this on titanium dioxide by JECFA and various other agencies around the world, concluding that the available evidence, does not raise safety concerns. And as recently as November 2023, JECFA determined that titanium dioxide was still a safe food additive. There are many, many publications, and I've got them listed below, where it was determined that titanium dioxide absolutely does not cause genotoxicity, which was the concern that led Europe to actually ban titanium dioxide. Let me skip in the interest of time. So let me conclude. This is kind of a concluding slide on the colors. There's many reasons, you can see them there, why we use colors in foods. It's very important for consumers when they're choosing foods. So here we're California banning synthetic colors. FDA is looking at that eventual ban, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And again, these synthetic colors have only shown associations. They've not shown causation. And people think the answer, including the current FDA, thinks the answer is let's go to natural colorants. And we do have natural colorants that are already in the food supply. FDA this year has approved a few new natural colorants, but these were approved. We know so much less about the toxicology and safety of these, since many of these natural colorants are complex mixtures of extracts from various plants and insects. Some have proteinaceous material that could be the cause of human allergenicity. These colors are more expensive. They're going to raise the price of foods as well here in the US. But they're also, unlike the synthetic colors that are very stable, these natural colorants can be sensitive to heat and light and changes in acidity. And you actually usually need more of a natural color than the same to get the same color as a synthetic color. So there's a lot of downsides to our jump to using natural colors, and these all have to be determined as we're going forward. This is a general slide of the next several slides. This is the new administration. This is FDA's enhanced approach to food chemical safety. I've listed several of them here. I will jump slide by slide and show you screenshots from each of these, but I wanted to have them here on one slide just for ease of going forward. In March of this year, FDA announced a chemical contaminants transparency tool. This is on a website where all contaminants, this is not food additives and color additives, these are unwanted contaminants in foods, and this website lists these unwanted contaminants and various action levels. In June of this year, FDA put out a new method for ranking chemicals in what we call post-market assessments. This would be where the chemical has already been approved, like things like BHA and BHT and the colors, and you want to determine in a post-market assessment, is the chemical still safe for intended use? So this policy was put up for review. FDA also put out in July what they're calling this expanded decision tree. I'm not going to go into details here, but it's a useful tool that FDA put up to try to determine what the potential risk of food ingredients may be. This is very important. This came out August 19th. This is a list of chemicals in the food supply that are under FDA review currently. And in the past administration, there was a July 2023 list that was updated in March 2024, but now this is the new list. And on the next two slides, I've got, there's two slides. This contains all of the chemicals that are under review at FDA. You can see there's BHA and BHT that I've already talked about. Here are all the colors And in the next slide, it ends here with titanium dioxide. So a lot of the chemicals that California and Texas and other states have already tried to ban, FDA is still in the process of trying to determine their safety. This occurred back in April of this year. Again, back to the synthetic food colors. The RFK Jr., the head of Health and Human Services, and the FDA commissioner had meetings with officials in various food and beverage companies, and they asked them if they would just voluntarily agree to leave the synthetic colors behind and try to move to new food colors. I'm sorry, new natural food colors. Again, I don't think the science is there. Many of us think the science is not there to be thinking about banning these chemicals. This is not an outright ban, but it is the attempt by the administration to have companies just quit the colors. And there have been many companies who have agreed that they will voluntarily stop the use of these synthetic colors. You've all heard about, I'm sure, the MAHA Commission report, and it's the strategy report that came out in September. I just want to put up a snapshot here of the main findings. This is the MAHA report that came out in May. Is not all about diet. It does discuss diet, but there are other things that the report also addresses. And in September, this strategy report, this is a 19-page report, quite readable. And it talks about things like the grass loophole that I've talked about earlier, and FDA's actions to try to go after various food ingredients and ultra-processed foods. You've heard this term often, I'm sure, this past year. Ultra-processed foods, we don't know what they are. Most people don't know what they are, but FDA put out a proposal in July proposing to define ultra-processed foods. The comment period is closing in the next couple of days. And so this is a document. If you want to look up some information on where FDA thinks they may be going on ultra-processed foods, this is the document that you could be looking at. This is the questions that FDA asked and USDA combined asked on trying to seek out information on ultra-processed foods. I won't go into those in detail right now. And more recently, California back in the act. Governor Newsom signed earlier this month a California Real Food Healthy Kids Act. Again, it started in the Assembly Bill 1264, which is a bill on trying to prevent the use of ultra-processed foods in school meals, again, public school feeding programs. California, again, is the first state to pass such legislation. It defines a UPF as one that contains any one ingredient, as simple as if it has a non-nutritive sweetener, it's considered a ultra-processed foods. It goes through other chemicals that they believe they're going to be going after. Deadlines are out over the next couple of years for defining what ultra-processed foods are, restricting them, but this runs out to almost a 10-year, back to 2035 is kind of a goal that was set in this act to get rid of these foods and kids' foods. Key takeaways. Let me finish by saying that, I've talked about the science of toxicology and risk assessment and how we do safety and approval of food additives. I believe, and most of us believe, that it should be based on strong science. I believe the states should be deferring to US FDA for both pre-market and post-market assessment of foods in order to avoid, you can't have 50 different states having their own laws, regulations, labels on food and color additives. And I think we should stick with where FDA is at this point. FDA, people are complaining that FDA doesn't do anything. I've been involved with FDA for my entire 46 years working in the food industry. And FDA has always used evidence-based science. They've always done risk assessments. They've been all over our food and color additives. And again, they're deeply involved now in trying to rethink how they're going to go forward at FDA based upon some of these new initiatives that I've listed above. Bottom line, though, talking here to registered dietitians, you are the trusted experts. It's been shown over and over that the public listens to registered dietitians. You're empowered to address any misinformation and disinformation based on evidence-based science. The idea is to try to foster consumer confidence in food and ingredient safety. So as I end this presentation, I urge you to get involved, seek out scientists who know the science of these food and color additives, and we encourage you to get involved in communicating about food safety risk. With that, let me complete. I do have a final slide. There's some additional resources that are links to key FDA website information. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity to have this presentation. Here is my disclosure. I am with the National Confectioners Association, and I've been with the organization for over 4 years. So Jim, in his presentation, mentioned about various factors that are considered in safety and risk evaluation. Particularly in risk evaluation, he also talked about exposure to humans. And so when you're looking at exposure to humans for a food or a color additive, you would also look at the amount of food that is consumed, the frequency with which a food is consumed. So those are some of the factors you would consider when you're looking at exposure to humans. We know that when you're consuming food, it's not only about exposure to food additives and color additives. Consumption of food also impacts consumption of other essential nutrients. We also know that in terms of purchasing and consumption, there are many other factors that influence human behavior. Some of the factors are persons' beliefs and attitudes towards foods. So I would like to put all of that in perspective today and talk about confectionery trends in terms of confectionery consumption, as well as consumers' attitudes and behaviors towards confectionery category, and then share some key takeaways. Confectionery products have a very special place in the lives of Americans. It plays a unique role in a balanced lifestyle. It is not only consumed as a treat, but it is savored, it is enjoyed, it is a part of our tradition, it's a part of our celebration for hundreds of years. However, with the rising rates of diet-related chronic diseases, our collective focus has been to increase consumption of nutrient-dense food and to reduce consumption of foods that are high in saturated fats, added sugar, and/or sodium. We know that the dietary guidelines for Americans continue to emphasize consumption of nutrient-dense foods and to reduce consumption of nutrients to limit, such as calories, added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. In order to understand the place of confectionery products in a balanced lifestyle, it is important to understand the confectionery consumption patterns. So here I have data from two separate sources. We have data from Sekerna Consumer Research, which shows that on an average, consumers consume confectionery products 2 to 3 times a week. We also have data from NHANES survey 2017 to March 2020, which tells us that on an average, confectionery products provide 40 calories and 1 teaspoon of added sugar per day. When we look at this information, what it tells us is that consumption of confectionery product is as a treat. It's not a center of the plate food. What is also very compelling about confectionery consumption is that for the past 10 to 12 years, the consumption patterns have been relatively stable. For example, data from Sekurna shows that from 2011 to 2023, the frequency of consumption has ranged between 2.6 to 2.9 times a week. What you heard from Jim is the exposure to food and color additive depends upon, again, frequency, amount of product consumed. And what this tells us is that the consumption of confectionery product is low, as a result of which exposure to either a food or a color additive is going to be low as well. Despite the increase that we see in the rising rates of diet-related chronic diseases, what we see is that the consumption patterns for confectionery are relatively stable. So now let's look at how consumption of confectionery patterns compares with consumption of other indulgent food products. So this is a slide from paper that was published in 2024. It's a white paper by Hank Cardello with Georgetown University. And this data comes from Enhanced 2017 to March of 2020. It's a pre-pandemic data. And here what we are showing is the amount of indulgent foods consumed, per capita consumption of indulgent foods. And what we see is candy and chocolate are consumed in relatively small amounts compared to some of these other food products. Here we are looking at contributions of calories from confectionery products as well as from other indulgent food products. So this data is from, again, Hank's paper, where we can see that candy contributes relatively small amount of calories compared to other indulgent food products. This chart is from a recent study by CDC, which looked at enhanced data from August 2021 to August 2023. So it's part of it is pandemic and part of it is post-pandemic data. And in this study, CDC was looking at the top 5 sources of calories, ultra-processed food sources for calories in youths as well as in adults. And we can see that both for youths and adults, there are 4 categories that are similar. What's also very interesting is that 3 of those categories align with what we see in Hank's paper. So beverages, sweet baked goods, and savory snacks are top 3 contributors of calories in the diets of Americans, whether you look at it from Hank's paper or CDC paper. This is again from Hank's paper, where we are looking at added sugar contributions from a variety of indulgent food products. And again, candy does contribute to added sugar, but its contribution is relatively less compared to some of these other food products. So kind of to summarize the data on consumption, confectionery products are consumed about 2 to 3 times a week. They're consumed as a treat. They are not the center of the plate foods. And also, it does contribute to added sugars and calories, but compared to other indulgent food products, its contribution is relatively small. So now let's look at what do consumers think about confectionery category. So this is the data from the International Food Information Council survey, which was conducted in 2023 on front of pack nutrition label. IFIC wanted to look at what are the different nutrients that the participants, the survey participants are looking for on nutrition facts panel. And this survey was specifically on those individuals that looked at nutrition facts panel. So we can see that these are the nutrients that they are looking at on nutrition facts panel. They also wanted to understand what kind of information they would be looking for on front of pack labels. So again, these are the nutrients that they're looking for or they would like to see on front of pack nutrition labels. And particularly for small packs, they're really interested in information on calories. So what this data from IFIC tells us is that consumers are interested in looking at these information because it can help them make informed choices. So now let's look at what kind of information consumers are looking for, particularly candy consumers are looking for when they're purchasing and consuming candy. So this data comes from NCA's survey. We conduct a survey every year, 1,500 participants, adult participants, ages 18 to 75 years old. And these are all candy consumers, and this is a nationally representative sample. So the information that they're looking for is not very different than what I showed in the previous slides. They're looking for added sugar, they're looking for total sugar, calorie content as well. What's interesting is they're also interested in serving size information, artificial ingredients, and variety of pack sizes or portion options. And this kind of makes sense because confectionery products are often used for gift purposes. So people could be buying larger packages for gifts and smaller packages for personal consumption. From our survey, we also see that more than 70% of consumers are not only interested in calorie and added sugar information, but they're saying that this information is important or somewhat important for them to have it on front of pack label. So this means that they really care about calorie and added sugar information on front of pack label. Greater than 88% of consumers think that having different pack size or portion options is important for them. And then greater than 77% of consumers think having individually wrapped pieces within a larger pack are important. And again, both of these data sets are telling us that they are interested in managing how much confectionery they eat by having either individually wrapped pieces or by having smaller portion options. So this data comes from an initiative that the confectionery industry undertook back in 2016. This was an initiative that was led by Partnership for Healthier America, where the confectionery industry wanted to provide transparency and to provide pack size options. So in the 2022 report showed that 95% of best-selling products had front of pack calorie labels. So this is how the industry is providing transparency. And then in 22 report, again, we saw that 50% of individually wrapped products were either 200 calories or less than 200 calories. So again, providing portion options. So I've been talking a lot about portions, and we see that the consumers are interested in portion options when it comes to confectionery, but they're also interested in portion options when it comes to prepackaged foods or when it comes to food preparation at home. This particular slide comes from Portion Balance Coalition white paper, which was published in 2024. And here we can see different factors that consumers consider when they're preparing food at home. And so we can divide these factors into three buckets. The first bucket would be all the factors above the red line. Then portions is the second bucket. And then the third bucket is all the factors under the red line. So after all the factors that are considered to be the core factors are considered, the next thing that consumers are looking for is portions. We know that the dietary guidelines has been consistently emphasizing portions as a tool to manage intake of calories and other nutrients, especially nutrients to limit. The most recent Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, which was published last year, said that small portions or pre-portioned meals can help in reducing energy intake both for adults and older adults. A little bit more about what consumers are looking for when it comes to confectionery products. So they said they're interested in better for you confectionery. We asked them, do you believe that there is something like better for you confectionery? And 53% of consumers say that they do believe that there is better for you confectionery. So we asked them to define what better for you confectionery is. And so here is a word cloud, which the description was provided by the consumers in terms of what they think is better for you confectionery. All of these were at least mentioned 3 times or more, and the bigger the font means those were mentioned more frequently. So dark chocolate obviously stands out as a better for you confectionery, which is followed by low and low sugar options, small portion options, and then other confectioneries with nuts and inclusion and vegan and organic products. We wanted to dig a little bit deeper into why they are interested in reduced sugar or low sugar options. And the primary driver is maintaining or losing weight and watching or managing sugar intake. 75% of consumers said that they are interested in this option mainly to lose weight. And then the boomers are interested in this option to manage their sugar intake. On the other hand, the young shoppers are interested in this option for taste preferences as well as to improve their skin appearance. Some more thoughts on what consumers think about candy and chocolate. 80% of consumers expect that there is sugar in confectionery products. 85% of consumers believe it is fine to occasionally have a piece of chocolate or candy. And 70% of consumers believe chocolate and candy belong in a happy, balanced lifestyle. So, with that, my key takeaways are confectionery are unique in the sense that they're consumed as a treat. They are not the center of the plate food. They're consumed in smaller amounts, about 2 to 3 times a week. And since the consumption of confectionery is small, exposure to these food and color additive is low as well. Confectionery consumers are interested in information regarding the product that they consume. They're interested in calories, added sugar. They're also interested in serving size. They're also interested in better for you confectionery, such as low and no sugar. And they're interested in small portion options. And all of this tells us that they're interested in confectionery as a treat, but they're also interested to make sure that they can manage their intake of added sugar and calorie and still enjoy the treat. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for listening to this webinar. Your attendance certificates are now available to download. You can follow the instructions on the screen or refer to these same instructions on the final page of the presentation handout to complete the webinar's post-test and evaluation and then access your certificate.